The first time Reese Carver saw the beast, it was lying half-buried in a muddy ravine, blood streaking its obsidian hide like crimson rivers cutting through volcanic rock. Its eyes, fierce and unrelenting, glared at him with the kind of primal intensity that froze even the most courageous. Reese had seen his share of predators on Earth: lions on the savanna, polar bears in the Arctic, but nothing compared to the sheer menace radiating from this creature. It was the Velkor, the apex predator of the planet Corvus, known across the galaxy for its speed, intelligence, and near unstoppable ferocity. The Velkor was said to embody everything nature could muster in the creation of a perfect hunter. Reese knew the stories well every wildlife biologist worth their salt did. Corvus was a hostile world, and the Velkor was its crown jewel. This particular Velkor, however, was in trouble. A deep gash ran across its flank, and one of its massive hind legs was twisted at an unnatural angle. Clawed footprints surrounded it in the mud, likely from an encounter with the less famous but equally dangerous grin wolves that prowled the forests. Despite its wounds, the Velkor held its head high, baring glistening fangs as Reese cautiously approached. "Well, aren't you a stubborn one?" Reese muttered under his breath. The Velkor growled, a guttural sound that reverberated through the ravine. It was a warning, a declaration of defiance even in its weakened state. Reese stopped a few meters away, hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to hurt you, big guy," Reese said softly, knowing full well the predator couldn't understand his words. Still, his tone was calm, measured, the same way he'd spoken to injured bears and wolves back on Earth. The Velkor snarled again, its tail flicking sharply despite the pain the motion must have caused. Reese glanced at the tail. Razor-sharp spines protruded from its tip, each one glinting like a blade in the pale Corvian sunlight. Behind him, the buzz of a hovering drone grew louder. Reese turned to see one of the medical units from the research outpost descending into the ravine, its reflective casing glinting like a beacon. The researchers back at the base must have been monitoring his progress. "Pull that thing back," Reese said into his comm. "You're just going to spook it." "This is the best way to administer aid," Carver came the response from Dr. Pelnar, the station's lead xenobiologist. "The Velkor isn't going to let you get close enough to help, and we can't risk." "Pull it back," Reese repeated, more firmly this time. He turned off the comm before Pelnar could argue. The Velkor's eyes darted toward the drone, its growl deepening into a full-bodied rumble that made the ground vibrate beneath Reese's boots. He glanced at the creature, then back at the hovering machine. "Yeah, I wouldn't trust that thing either," he muttered. With a sharp whistle, Reese waved the drone away. After a moment of hesitation, it ascended, the buzz fading into the distance. The Velkor's growl softened, though its eyes never left Reese. "Okay," Reese said, crouching low. "Just you and me now." The Velkor shifted slightly, wincing as its injured leg dragged against the ground. Reese could see the strain in its movements, the way its muscles twitched in pain. He knew the creature wouldn't survive without intervention. Infection would set in, and on a world as unforgiving as Corvus, that was a death sentence. But getting close enough to help? That was another problem entirely. Reese didn't try to approach again that day. Instead, he backed off, sitting a safe distance away and observing the predator as it alternated between snarling at him and resting its massive head on its forelegs. By nightfall, the Velkor still hadn't moved. Reese set up a small camp nearby, lighting a low fire for warmth and cooking a protein bar he'd brought along. The Velkor watched him the entire time, its golden eyes gleaming in the darkness. "I'm not going anywhere," Reese said, holding up a piece of the cooked bar. "You're stuck with me, pal." The Velkor snorted but didn't respond otherwise. The next morning, Reese tried a different approach. He scavenged the area for some of the local fruits' bright orange globes that looked like oversized berries. From his research, he knew the Velkor occasionally consumed them, though they were primarily carnivores. He rolled one toward the creature, stopping a few feet short of its snout. The Velkor sniffed at it but didn't eat, its gaze flicking back to Reese with suspicion. Reese sighed, leaning back on his heels. "Fine," he said. "I'll just sit here until you realize I'm not the enemy." The hours dragged on. Reese busied himself cleaning his equipment, sketching the Velkor in his notebook, and jotting down observations about its behavior. Every now and then, the creature would shift its position, wincing as its wounds stretched, but it still refused to let Reese or anyone else get close. The drone returned once, and the Velkor's snarl was immediate and vicious. Reese sent it away again, ignoring Pelnar's frustrated protests over the comm. Days turned into a week. Reese established a routine, carefully inching closer each day as he gained the Velkor's reluctant tolerance. He noticed subtle changes in its behavior. Its growls grew quieter, its posture less rigid. Still, it kept its sharp eyes trained on him, a reminder that any misstep could end poorly. Finally, after 10 days, Reese saw an opportunity. The Velkor had drifted into a shallow sleep, its breaths coming in slow, steady huffs. Moving cautiously, Reese retrieved a medical kit from his pack and approached, one agonizing step at a time. The Velkor's ear twitched as he knelt beside it, and its eyes snapped open, pupils narrowing to slits. Reese froze, his hands held up defensively. "Easy," he murmured. "I just want to help." The Velkor let out a low rumble, its gaze locked on him. Reese stayed perfectly still, his heart pounding in his chest. After what felt like an eternity, the Velkor relaxed slightly, resting its head back on the ground. It didn't take its eyes off him, but it didn't attack either. Taking that as permission, Reese carefully examined the creature's wounds. The gash on its flank was deep, but not as bad as he'd feared. The leg, however, was another story. The bone was fractured, and swelling had set in. Reese worked quickly, cleaning the wounds and applying a salve to prevent infection. When he was done, he sat back, exhaling a shaky breath. The Velkor huffed softly, as if acknowledging his effort. "Guess we're making progress," Reese said with a small smile. For the first time, the Velkor didn't growl. The first light of dawn crept over the ravine, painting the muddy walls in hues of gold and amber. Reese stirred from his makeshift camp, stiff from sleeping on uneven ground, but alert. His eyes immediately sought the Velkor. It was still there, lying in the same spot, its massive chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. "Morning, big guy," Reese said, his voice low and calm. He didn't expect a response, of course, but he had taken to talking to the creature as if it were a colleague in the field. It helped fill the silence, and maybe, on some instinctive level, the Velkor found it less threatening. The predator's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, but it didn't move otherwise. That was a good sign. Reese took it as permission to continue his routine. He set about boiling water for a quick breakfast, carefully rationing his supplies. The research station had offered to send more food via drone, but Reese had refused, knowing how the machine agitated the Velkor. He'd rather survive on foraged fruits and nutrient bars than risk undoing the fragile trust he was building. When the Velkor finally stirred, it lifted its head just enough to sniff the air, its golden eyes fixed on Reese, unblinking, as if weighing him against some unseen measure. "You smell the food," Reese said with a smirk. He tore off a piece of his bar and tossed it in the Velkor's direction. It landed a few feet away, well within reach. The Velkor's nostrils flared, but it made no move to eat. Reese sighed, leaning back against a tree. "Still not a fan of human cuisine. Can't say I blame you." The day stretched on, and Reese returned to the task of caring for the Velkor's wounds. The salve he'd applied seemed to be working. There was no sign of infection, and the swelling in its leg had gone down slightly. But the fracture itself was still a problem. Without proper immobilization, the bone wouldn't heal correctly, leaving the Velkor vulnerable in the long term. Reese began gathering sturdy branches and vines, fashioning a crude splint. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best he could manage with the resources at hand. When he approached the Velkor with the splint, the creature let out a low growl, its ears flattening against its skull. Reese stopped a few steps short, holding the makeshift contraption in front of him like a peace offering. "Relax," he said, his voice steady. "I know it's not pretty, but it'll help." The Velkor's growl deepened, but it didn't strike. Reese took that as a grudging invitation to continue. Working as carefully as possible, he maneuvered the splint into place, wrapping the vines tightly around the injured leg. The Velkor flinched and let out a sharp, guttural sound, but it didn't lash out. Reese murmured soothing words as he worked, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. When the splint was finally secure, Reese sat back, wiping sweat from his brow. The Velkor tested the contraption with a tentative movement, its claws scraping against the ground. It looked at Reese, its gaze piercing and unreadable. "Yeah, I know," Reese said. "Not exactly state-of-the-art, but it'll hold." The Velkor blinked slowly, its ears twitching. Reese wasn't sure if that meant approval or mere tolerance, but it was progress. That night, as Reese sat by his fire, he caught the Velkor watching him from its resting spot. It wasn't the usual predatory stare he'd grown accustomed to. There was something different in its eyes, curiosity perhaps, or maybe just a flicker of understanding. Reese held up his hands in mock surrender. "Don't look at me like that. I'm just trying to keep you alive." The Velkor huffed, a sound somewhere between a growl and a sigh. Reese chuckled. "I'll take that as a thank you." The following days brought a subtle but noticeable shift in the Velkor's behavior. It began allowing Reese to approach more freely, even tolerating his presence as he cleaned and rewrapped its wounds. The predator's growls grew softer, less hostile, though it remained watchful at all times. Reese continued to forage for food, venturing farther into the surrounding forest as the Velkor's condition stabilized. He kept his excursions short, never straying so far that he couldn't return quickly if needed. The Velkor's injuries might have kept it grounded, but it was still a predator, and Reese wasn't about to underestimate its instincts. On one such excursion, Reese stumbled across a trail of grin wolf tracks. The sight made his stomach tighten. The wolves were fierce pack hunters, and their territory often overlapped with the Velkor's. If they returned, they'd pose a serious threat, especially to an injured predator. Reese hurried back to the ravine, his mind racing. When he arrived, the Velkor was lying in the shade of a gnarled tree, its golden eyes snapping open at the sound of his approach. "We might have company soon," Reese said, kneeling beside it. "Big, toothy company." The Velkor's ears flicked, but it didn't seem concerned. Reese envied its confidence. He spent the rest of the day fortifying the area as best he could, stacking rocks and branches to create barriers that might slow the wolves down. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. As night fell, Reese sat by the fire, his senses on high alert. The Velkor rested nearby, its tail twitching occasionally in its sleep. The first howl came just before midnight. Reese stiffened, his hand instinctively reaching for the tranquilizer gun at his side. The howl was followed by another, then another, each one closer than the last. The Velkor's eyes snapped open, its ears swiveling toward the sound. It pushed itself upright, its muscles coiled and ready, despite its injuries. Reese felt a chill run down his spine. "Stay down," he whispered, though he knew the words were futile. The wolves arrived moments later, their glowing eyes and sleek, dark forms emerging from the shadows. They spread out in a semicircle, their movements calculated and deliberate. Reese raised his tranquilizer gun, aiming at the largest wolf. "All right, guys," he muttered. "Let's not do anything stupid." The lead wolf growled, its lips pulling back to reveal razor-sharp teeth. The pack tensed, ready to strike. And then the Velkor roared. It was a sound like nothing Reese had ever heard, a deep, guttural bellow that seemed to shake the very ground. The wolves froze, their confidence faltering in the face of the apex predator's fury. Despite its injuries, the Velkor stood tall, its obsidian hide gleaming in the firelight. It let out another roar, and this time the wolves retreated, their tails tucked between their legs. Reese lowered his gun, his heart pounding. He glanced at the Velkor, a mixture of awe and gratitude washing over him. "Remind me never to get on your bad side," he said, his voice shaky. The Velkor didn't respond, but as it settled back down, Reese could have sworn he saw a hint of satisfaction in its eyes. The Velkor had started moving again, though every step it took was marked by the stiff awkwardness of healing injuries. Reese watched as it limped along the edge of the ravine, testing its weight on the injured leg. The fractured bone had been set and wrapped as best as Reese could manage, and the salve he'd applied was doing its job. Even so, the predator's recovery was far from complete, and it seemed to know it. The Velkor growled low whenever Reese got too close, though it no longer snarled or bared its fangs as it once had. The change in behavior was subtle, but Reese recognized it for what it was: a quiet acknowledgement of his presence, if not full trust. "You're stubborn as hell. You know that," Reese muttered, crouching nearby. The Velkor turned its head, fixing him with a piercing stare. For a moment, Reese thought he'd overstepped, but the predator merely huffed and continued its slow, measured pace. Reese had been shadowing the Velkor for weeks now, his days spent ensuring it didn't aggravate its injuries while gathering data on the surrounding environment. He'd long since stopped trying to call for backup from the research station every time one of their drones came within a mile of the Velkor. The predator's reaction was explosive. The creature had made it abundantly clear Reese was the only one it would tolerate. That fact didn't sit well with Dr. Pelnar. "You're putting yourself at enormous risk." Carver Pelnar's voice crackled over the comm one evening. Reese had set up camp a few hundred meters from the Velkor, giving the creature its space while it rested. "Yeah, well, the Velkor doesn't exactly have a hotline for injured wildlife," Reese replied, sipping from his water canteen. "I'm serious. This thing is an apex predator. You're dealing with an animal that could kill you in a heartbeat." "Trust me, Doc, I haven't forgotten. But it hasn't tried yet, which is more than I can say for your drones." Pelnar sighed audibly. "You're not trained for this kind of work, Reese." "I'm trained to keep things alive," Reese said. "And that's what I'm doing." The line went silent after that, though Reese suspected Pelnar was still monitoring him from afar. It didn't matter. He'd made his choice, and the Velkor had made its own. One afternoon, as Reese was collecting samples from a nearby stream, he heard a sharp, guttural bark from the direction of the Velkor. He froze, his heart leaping into his throat. The sound wasn't the Velkor's usual growl of annoyance, it was sharper, more urgent. Dropping his tools, Reese sprinted back toward the ravine. He found the Velkor standing stiffly near a thicket of gnarled shrubs, its injured leg trembling under its weight. The predator's tail was lashing, the spines glinting in the sunlight, and its ears were pinned flat against its skull. Something was wrong. Reese scanned the area, his eyes narrowing as he spotted movement in the underbrush. At first it was just a faint rustle, but then he saw them grin wolves. There were 3 of them, sleek and wiry, with mottled gray fur and eyes that glinted with predatory cunning. Grin wolves were opportunistic hunters, known for targeting weakened prey, and it didn't take a genius to figure out why they were here. The Velkor let out another bark, this one louder and more forceful. The wolves hesitated, their heads lowering as they crept closer, their lean bodies tense and ready to strike. Reese's mind raced. He had no weapons, no way to fend off the predators, and the Velkor was in no condition to fight them off alone. "All right, Carver," Reese muttered to himself. The first wolf lunged, and the Velkor met it with a swipe of its claws, sending the predator skidding across the ground. The other 2 wolves darted in, snapping at the Velkor's flanks, and Reese could see the strain in the injured creature's movements. Without thinking, Reese grabbed a long branch from the ground and charged. "Get away from it," he shouted, waving the branch wildly. The wolves recoiled, startled by the sudden noise and movement. One of them turned toward Reese, its lips curling back in a snarl. "Yeah, come on." Then Reese yelled, jabbing the branch toward the wolf. The wolf hesitated, its ears flattening as it assessed this new threat. Behind it, the Velkor let out a thunderous roar, its tail whipping around and catching another wolf with its spines. The injured predator was holding its ground, its golden eyes blazing with defiance. Reese swung the branch again, driving the wolves back another step. The predators exchanged glances, their postures shifting as they seemed to reconsider their odds. Finally, with a frustrated yip, the wolves retreated, disappearing into the underbrush as quickly as they'd appeared. Reese let out a shaky breath, his hands trembling as he dropped the branch. He turned to the Velkor, which was breathing heavily but still standing tall. Its gaze met his, and for a moment, they simply stared at each other. "Looks like we make a pretty good team," Reese said, his voice hoarse. The Velkor huffed softly, its tail swishing in what might have been approval. For the first time, Reese thought he saw something in the predator's eyes that hadn't been there before, a flicker of trust. The Velkor's recovery had taken a significant step forward after their encounter with the Grin wolves. Although it still moved with a limp, the predator seemed reinvigorated, as if the battle had reawakened its indomitable spirit. Reese noticed it standing straighter, its injured leg supporting more weight each day. Reese, meanwhile, was trying not to collapse from exhaustion. Between monitoring the Velkor, scouting for supplies, and fending off occasional threats, his days were an endless cycle of work. But he wasn't about to stop, not when they'd come this far. The Velkor had grown accustomed to his presence, following him at a cautious distance whenever he ventured out. At first, Reese thought it might be coincidence, but the more he watched, the more he realized the creature was deliberately staying close. It was a strange feeling, being shadowed by something that could easily kill him. Yet the Velkor's demeanor was calm, almost protective, as if it had decided Reese was part of its territory now. One evening, Reese sat by the fire, scribbling notes in his journal while the Velkor lay a few meters away. The predator's breathing was slow and steady, its golden eyes half closed in the flickering light. "You know," Reese said aloud, glancing at the Velkor, "I've got people back at the station who think I'm crazy for sticking around out here. They say you're a lost cause." The Velkor didn't respond, of course, but its ear twitched as if acknowledging his voice. "But I don't buy that," Reese continued. "You're not just some animal. You've got fight in you, and I'll be damned if I let anyone write you off." The Velkor shifted slightly, its tail curling around its body. Reese smiled to himself, taking the movement as a sign of agreement. The days that followed were marked by small victories. Reese watched as the Velkor began hunting again, its movements cautious but calculated. It targeted smaller prey, at first swift rodents and lizard-like creatures that darted through the underbrush. Each successful hunt seemed to bolster its confidence, and Reese couldn't help but feel a sense of pride watching it regain its strength. It wasn't just the Velkor that had changed, though. Reese found himself relying on the predator in ways he hadn't expected. The first time he'd spotted another pack of Grin wolves lurking in the distance, it was the Velkor that had scared them off with a warning growl. Another time, when Reese accidentally stepped too close to a nest of venomous insects, the Velkor had swatted the ground with its tail, scattering the swarm before they could attack. Their partnership, strange as it was, had become a lifeline. Reese was inspecting a cluster of moss-covered rocks one morning when he heard a low, droning hum that sent a chill down his spine. He turned toward the sky, his stomach sinking, as he spotted the source of the noise, a research drone. "Seriously," Reese muttered under his breath, shading his eyes against the sun. The drone was larger than the ones Pelnar had sent before, its polished exterior gleaming like a beacon. Reese's comm crackled to life a moment later. "Carver, this is Dr. Pelnar," the scientist's voice said, sharp and commanding. "We've detected Grin wolf activity in your area. The drone is equipped to provide assistance." "I don't need your help," Reese snapped, glaring at the hovering machine. "We've got things under control." "You're risking your life out there for a single animal," Pelnar said. "It's time to stop playing games. Let the drone do its job." Reese opened his mouth to argue, but the Velkor's reaction cut him off. The predator had risen to its feet, its fur bristling as it let out a deep, guttural growl. It took a menacing step forward, its gaze locked on the drone with unbridled fury. Reese had seen that look before. It was the same expression the Velkor had worn during its battle with the Grin wolves. "Pull the drone back," Reese said into the comm, his voice low but firm. "Carver." "Pull it back," Reese repeated. "Now." There was a long pause, followed by a frustrated sigh. "Fine. But this is your responsibility, Carver." The drone's hum faded as it ascended, disappearing over the ridge. The Velkor's growl subsided, but it remained tense, its eyes scanning the horizon for any other threats. "Thanks for not overreacting," Reese said, exhaling slowly. The Velkor flicked its tail, its version of an unimpressed glare, and settled back onto the ground. Reese couldn't help but laugh. "You're a piece of work, you know that." By the 5th week, Reese knew it was time to leave. The Velkor had healed remarkably well, its movements fluid and confident once more. It no longer needed his care, and the planet's ecosystem was stable enough that the predator could reclaim its territory without issue. Still, the thought of parting ways filled Reese with an odd sense of loss. He'd spent so long with the creature, sharing its struggles and triumphs, that it felt strange to think of going back to the sterile halls of the research station. Their final morning together was quiet. Reese packed his belongings while the Velkor watched from a distance, its golden eyes following his every move. When he was finished, he stood and turned to face it. "Well," he said, "guess this is it." The Velkor rose to its feet, its towering form casting a long shadow over the ravine. For a moment, it simply stared at him, its gaze unblinking and intense. Then, to Reese's astonishment, it stepped closer. Reese held his breath as the predator lowered its head, stopping just short of touching him. He reached out hesitantly, his hand brushing against the Velkor's smooth, obsidian hide. "Take care of yourself, big guy," Reese said softly. The Velkor let out a low, rumbling sound that wasn't quite a growl. It was deeper, more resonant, almost like acknowledgement. Then, with a flick of its tail, the predator turned and strode into the forest, disappearing into the shadows. Reese stood there for a long time, staring after it. Finally, he shouldered his pack and began the long trek back to the research station. When he arrived, Pelnar was waiting for him, her expression a mix of relief and exasperation. "I trust your adventure was worth it," she asked, arching an eyebrow. "More than you could imagine," Reese replied with a small smile. As he walked past her, heading toward the station's debriefing room, he couldn't help but glance back at the horizon. Somewhere out there, the Velkor was alive and thriving, and in the end, that was all that mattered.